The sterile hum of the dialysis machine in the master bedroom was the only sound competing with the vibration of his wife's phone on the nightstand, a notification that lit up the dark room at 2 o'clock a.m. Lucas watched through half-closed eyes as Elena reached for the device, her face illuminated by a soft, guilty glow, a smile playing on her lips that she hadn't given him since his diagnosis. It is in the silence of a sick room where the loudest betrayals often happen, spoken not in words, but in the deliberate turn of a back. If you want to witness how a man walks away from the wreckage to build a kingdom from his own ashes, stay with me for the rest of this journey. The penthouse smelled of antiseptic and stale lavender, a sickly sweet combination that seemed to cling to the curtains of the master bedroom. Outside, the Chicago wind whipped against the floor-to-ceiling glass, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of gold and red. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator beside the bed. Lucas Thorne lay still, his frame gaunt beneath the high-thread count sheets. The illness, a systemic autoimmune flare that had stolen the last 18 months of his life, had taken the muscle from his arms and the color from his face. But it hadn't touched his mind. His eyes, dark and observant, tracked his wife as she moved around the dressing room. Elena was a blur of motion, a vibrant contrast to his stillness. She was applying lipstick in the vanity mirror, the shade a deep, bruised crimson. She pressed her lips together, checked her reflection, and then smoothed the fabric of her black cocktail dress. It was backless, daring. Too daring for a charity auction for pediatric medicine, Lucas thought. But he said nothing. "I shouldn't be long," Elena said, her voice pitched slightly too high. She didn't look at him in the mirror. She looked past his reflection, focusing on her diamond earrings. "It's just, you know how the board gets if I don't show face. The gallery needs the donors." "Of course," Lucas whispered. His voice was raspy, unused. "Go. The nurses are just a call away." Elena finally turned. She walked to the side of the bed but didn't sit down. She hovered, maintaining a safe, sanitary distance. She placed a hand on his blanket-covered shin, a gesture that felt more like checking for a pulse than offering comfort. "You look tired, Lucas. Try to sleep." "I always sleep," he replied, a faint, dry irony in his tone. She leaned in to kiss his forehead. That was when it hit him. It wasn't just her perfume, the expensive sandalwood scent she'd worn for years. Beneath that, layered faintly but unmistakably on her skin and in her hair, was the sharp, muskier scent of rain and men's cologne. Hugo Boss, specifically the blend Julian, the 28-year-old sculptor she had been mentoring for 6 months, wore. Lucas stopped breathing for a second, the air catching in his damaged lungs. He knew that scent. He had smelled it on her coat last week. He had smelled it on her skin when she came back from yoga on Tuesday. Elena pulled back, oblivious to the realization that had just shattered the last remnant of Lucas's hope. She checked her phone, shielding the screen with a practiced tilt of her wrist. "I have to run. The Uber is downstairs," she said, grabbing her clutch. "Elena," Lucas said. She stopped at the doorway, her hand on the brass handle. "Yes? You look beautiful." It wasn't a compliment. It was an accusation. Though she didn't hear it, she smiled, a quick, relieved expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks, honey. Get some rest." The heavy oak door clicked shut. Lucas listened to the sound of her heels clicking down the hallway, fading until the elevator chimed. Alone again. He turned his head slowly toward the nightstand. She had left her iPad. It was sitting on the stack of medical journals, glowing faintly as a notification pushed through the lock screen. Because they shared an Apple ID for the household automation, her messages often synced when she was on Wi-Fi. Lucas reached out, his hand trembling not from emotion, but from the physical effort of lifting his arm. He tapped the screen. The passcode was his birthday. She hadn't even bothered to change it. A message from Jay popped up at the top of the screen. "Jay, I'm outside. Told the driver to wait around the block. Can't wait to get you out of that depressing place. Wear the black dress." Lucas stared at the words. The glow of the screen reflected in his eyes, cold and blue. The pain in his joints was sudden and sharp, but it was eclipsed by a strange icy clarity. He wasn't just dying, he was being erased. He let the iPad drop onto the mattress. He looked at the window, at the reflection of a man who looked like a ghost. "Not yet," he whispered to the empty room. He reached for the landline phone, the one line she couldn't monitor from her cell. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. "It's Lucas," he said when the voice on the other end answered. "I'm ready to liquidate everything." "Liquidate?" The voice on the other end of the line was thick with sleep and confusion. Marcus, Lucas's attorney and oldest friend, cleared his throat. "Lucas, it's 2 in the morning. Are you in pain? Is this the medication talking?" "I'm lucid, Marcus. More than I have been in months," Lucas replied. He kept his eyes fixed on the iPad resting on his knees. The screen's blue light painted his hollow cheeks in a ghostly hue. "I want the insolvency protocol we drafted when I was first diagnosed. The one you said was too extreme. That protocol strips the assets from the personal accounts and dumps the debt into the primary residence," Marcus warned, his tone shifting from sleepy to professional. "If you do that, and Elena is on the deed, she'll be left holding a mortgage she can't service. It's financial suicide for the household." "Do it," Lucas said, his finger hovering over the Photos app. "But before you execute, I need 24 hours. I need to know exactly how much she's already taken." He put the phone on speaker and set it on the nightstand. His hands, usually trembling from the neuropathy, were steady with a terrifying resolve. He opened the photo gallery. It was innocent enough at first. Screenshots of recipes, photos of the cat, promotional images for the gallery. Then he went to the recently deleted folder. It was a digital graveyard of his marriage. There was a video dated 3 days ago. Lucas tapped play. The sound was off, but the image was crystal clear. It was taken inside the penthouse, in the living room downstairs while Lucas had been sedated for his dialysis treatment. Elena was laughing, holding a glass of wine. Julian was there, shirtless, pacing the room like he owned it. He was mimicking Lucas's limp, dragging one leg behind him while holding a phantom cane. Elena threw her head back in delight. Lucas felt a cold flush spread through his chest, freezing the blood in his veins. They weren't just betraying him, they were waiting for him to die. They were comfortable in his tragedy. He swiped to the next item. It was a screenshot of a text thread. "Julian, the gallery space is tight. I need a bigger studio." "Elena, just wait a little longer, baby. The doctors say his kidney function is dropping fast. Once he's gone, the master suite has the best north-facing light. We'll tear down that ugly drafting table and make it your workspace." Lucas looked up from the screen to the corner of the room where his drafting table sat covered in a dust sheet. That table was where he had designed the St. Jude spire. It was where he had built his career. She didn't just want his money, she wanted to overwrite his existence. He scrolled further. Bank notifications, transfers of $5,000, $10,000, labeled as consulting fees, to a shell company he recognized as Julian's LLC. She was siphoning his liquid cash to fund her lover's lifestyle while Lucas lay upstairs, worrying about insurance copays. The grief he expected to feel didn't come. Instead, a sensation akin to the structural settling of a great building took over. The foundation had cracked, but the steel core remained. He picked up the phone again. "Marcus?" "I'm here, Lucas. I'm looking at the accounts now. You're right. There's significant hemorrhage in the joint savings." "Let it bleed for one more day," Lucas said, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the hum of the medical machinery. "I'm leaving tomorrow night. I want the transfer of the deed to be timed exactly for when I board the plane." "And Marcus?" "Yes?" "Cancel the life insurance policy. The one with her as the sole beneficiary." "Lucas, if you die without that policy—" "I don't plan on dying, Marcus. Not anymore." Lucas hung up. He looked at the iPad one last time, then carefully wiped his fingerprints from the screen with the edge of the sheet. He placed it back exactly where she had left it, the notifications still glowing. He lay back against the pillows, closing his eyes, listening to the wind howl against the glass. For the first time in a year, he didn't feel like a patient. He felt like an architect again, and he was about to design a masterpiece of ruin. The following evening, the rain had turned into a relentless sheet of gray that washed over Chicago, obscuring the horizon. It was perfect cover. Elena was running late again. She moved through the bedroom with frantic energy, throwing dresses onto the chaise lounge. She settled on a shimmering silver slip dress, something that looked like liquid mercury against her skin. "I'm so sorry, Lucas," she said, fastening a pearl necklace. She didn't look sorry. She looked exhilaratingly alive. The gallery board called an emergency dinner. They're talking about a new installation for the autumn season. I have to secure the funding. Lucas lay on the bed, his eyes half closed. He had spent the day conserving every ounce of energy, refusing his afternoon sedative so his mind would be sharp. "Go," he rasped, coughing slightly for effect. "Secure the future, Elena." She paused, perhaps catching the double meaning, but dismissed it. She walked over, her perfume cloud enveloping him. No cologne this time, she had been more careful, and patted his hand. "I'll check on you when I get back, maybe around midnight." "Goodbye, Elena," he said. He didn't say goodnight. She didn't notice the distinction. The door clicked shut, engaging the magnetic lock. Lucas waited 5 minutes, then 10. He listened to the hum of the elevator descending 40 floors. Then he sat up. The motion made his head spin, but the adrenaline surging through his veins acted as a powerful counterweight to his illness. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed. For the first time in months, he stood up without calling for a nurse. His legs were thin, trembling under his own weight, but they held. He didn't pack a suitcase. Suitcases implied a trip. This was an erasure. He walked to the walk-in closet, bypassing the rows of bespoke Italian suits he would never wear again. He reached into the back of the safe, the combination was still the date they met, a number she had likely forgotten, and pulled out a thick envelope Marcus had couriered over earlier that afternoon via a private messenger. Inside was his passport, a new debit card linked to an offshore account, and the transfer documents for the penthouse. Lucas took the documents to the bedside table. He placed the deed on top of the iPad she had used to betray him. The paperwork was clear. The ownership of the penthouse was now solely in Elena's name, along with the 3 mortgages Marcus had quietly restructured to fall due immediately upon the transfer of title. It was a gift that was actually a bomb. He looked at his left hand. The gold band felt heavy, a shackle he had worn for 7 years. He twisted it. It was loose now. He had lost so much weight. It slid off over the knuckle with pathetic ease. He placed the ring in the center of the document, right over the signature line. A text buzzed on his burner phone, a simple device he had bought online days ago. "Transport is at the service entrance, a minute." Lucas put on a thick wool coat over his pajamas. He didn't bother changing. He slipped his feet into loafers. He looked around the room one last time. The dialysis machine stood like a silent sentinel in the corner. The art on the walls, pieces Elena had chosen, looked garish and hollow. He felt a pang of sorrow, sharp and deep. But it wasn't for Elena. It was for the man he used to be, the man who had bought this apartment thinking it would be a home. That man had died in this room, slowly, over 18 months. He walked to the door, bypassing the elevator for the service corridor. He moved like a shadow, his breathing labored, but his resolve ironclad. He stepped into the hallway, the heavy door closing with a final, decisive thud that echoed like a gavel striking a sounding block. Lucas Thorne stepped into the service elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. He did not look back. It was nearly 3:00 a.m. when Elena keyed into the penthouse. She was humming a soft, shapeless tune, her body still buzzing with the residual warmth of Julian sheets and the expensive Cabernet from dinner. She kicked off her heels in the foyer, letting them lie where they fell on the marble floor, a small rebellion against the order Lucas had always prized. Usually the apartment had a specific acoustic texture at this hour. There was the low, rhythmic whoosh click of the dialysis machine from the master bedroom, a mechanical heartbeat that had become the soundtrack of her resentment. Tonight there was nothing. The silence was absolute. It pressed against her ears, heavier than the noise of the city outside. "Lucas," she called out, her voice echoing down the hallway. It sounded too loud, unnatural. She walked toward the bedroom, a strange cocktail of anxiety and dark anticipation rising in her chest. Did it happen, she wondered? Did his heart finally give out? She hated herself for the flicker of relief that accompanied the thought, but she didn't suppress it. If he was gone, the waiting was over. She could finally breathe. She pushed the bedroom door open. The room was cold. The window, usually kept shut to regulate the temperature for Lucas, was cracked open slightly, letting in the damp chill of the Chicago night. The curtains billowed like ghosts. The bed was empty, not just empty, but undisturbed. The sheets were smoothed flat, the pillows stacked neatly. The medical machinery, the monitors, the oxygen concentrator, sat dark and unplugged, their LED eyes lifeless. "Lucas," she whispered, checking the bathroom. Empty. The closet. Empty. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, not with grief, but with confusion. He couldn't walk to the kitchen without assistance. He certainly couldn't leave the apartment. She moved to the bedside table, her hand trembling as she reached for the lamp. Light flooded the sterile space, illuminating the only things left on the surface: her iPad and a stack of legal documents. Resting squarely in the center of the paperwork was a gold wedding band. Elena picked up the ring. It was cold to the touch. She stared at it, her mind struggling to catch up with reality. He hadn't died. He had left. She looked down at the documents. The header was bold and undeniable: deed of transfer and assumption of liability. Her eyes scanned the legalese, her breath hitching. Lucas Thorne hereby transfers full ownership of the property. Sole beneficiary Elena Thorne. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. He had given her the apartment, just like that. She felt a sudden rush of victory. He had left, and he had left her everything. She reached for her phone to text Julian, her thumbs flying across the screen. "He's gone. He actually left. The penthouse is mine." But then her eyes drifted to the second paragraph, the one highlighted in a brutal yellow marker stroke. Beneficiary assumes full responsibility for all attached liens, including the secondary and tertiary mortgages executed on today's date. Total outstanding principal, $4.2 million. The phone slipped from her fingers and hit the carpet with a dull thud. She froze. $4.2 million. The apartment was worth 3, maybe 3.5 in this market. He hadn't given her an asset. He had handcuffed her to a sinking ship. She scrambled to the iPad, unlocking it frantically. She checked the joint accounts. Balance, $0. Status, closed. She checked the credit cards. Status, frozen. Elena sank onto the edge of the bed where she had refused to sleep for months. The silence of the room wasn't peaceful anymore. It was predatory. The wind howled through the crack in the window, sounding less like a breeze and more like laughter. She was alone. She was the sole owner of a glass cage she couldn't afford to heat, let alone keep. "Lucas!" she screamed at the empty room, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and terrified. But the only answer was the view of the city skyline he had built, glittering indifferently in the distance. The air in the Swiss Alps was thin, sharp, and tasted of iron. It was a stark contrast to the humid, recirculated oxygen of the Chicago penthouse. Here, every breath had to be earned. Lucas stood at the edge of the therapy pool, the water a calm turquoise sheet. He gripped the stainless steel railing until his knuckles turned white. "Again," Dr. Vogel said from the sidelines, his voice dispassionate. 10 more steps without the cane." Lucas gritted his teeth. His legs, once wasted away to bone and tendon, now showed the definition of new: muscle, wiry, tight, and hard-won. He took a step. Pain shot up his thigh, a familiar companion he had learned to ignore. He took another. 3 years. The first year had been a blur of needles, blood transfusions, an experimental immunotherapy that felt like fire running through his veins. He had spent months watching the snow fall outside his window, communicating with the world only through encrypted emails and proxy servers. He had watched his bank account dwindle and then explode upwards again as he quietly consulted on projects in Dubai and Singapore under a pseudonym. The second year had been about structure, rebuilding the frame. He hired a private trainer who didn't care about his medical history, only his limits. He lifted weights until his arms shook. He swam until his lungs burned. He ate meals designed for fuel, not pleasure. Now, in the third year, he was no longer rebuilding. He was refining. He finished the 10th step and pulled himself out of the pool. He didn't collapse. He stood, water dripping from his torso, grabbing a towel. He caught his reflection in the glass wall. The ghost was gone. The man staring back was 42, but he looked etched from granite. His hair was grayer at the temples, cut short and severe. His face was lined, not from sickness, but from a hardened, stoic focus. The softness of the husband who had bought flowers and tolerated disrespect was dead. He walked to the locker room, dressing in a fitted charcoal suit. It was bespoke, tailored to his new dimensions. He sat on the bench and opened his laptop. A news alert from Chicago popped up. The Thorn Gallows Gallery files for Chapter 11. Bankruptcy protection. Lucas stared at the headline. Elena had lasted longer than he expected. She must have sold off the private collection, maybe even her jewelry, to keep the lights on. But the mortgage on the penthouse, the debt he had shackled her with, was a math problem she couldn't solve with a smile or a flirtatious glance. He clicked the window closed without reading the article. It didn't matter. It was just debris in the rearview mirror. His phone buzzed. It was Marcus. The contract is finalized, Marcus said. The city council approved the design for the new Lakefront Cultural Center. They want to announce the lead architect next week. They're expecting a representative from your firm. They won't get a representative, Lucas said, his voice deep and steady. He buttoned his cuff. They'll get me. Are you ready, Lucas? Chicago is small. You'll see her? Lucas stood up, picking up his watch, a new one, heavy and Swiss-made. He strapped it on, covering the faint scar on his wrist from the IV lines. I'm not going back for her, Marcus. I'm going back for my city. He walked out of the clinic and into the blinding white snow. A black car was waiting, engine running, ready to take him to Zurich Airport. He didn't look back at the sanctuary that had saved him. He looked forward, toward the skyline he was about to conquer, the grand ballroom of the Palmer House. Hilton was suffocatingly hot, packed with the city's elite city council members and a hungry press corps. The air buzzed with speculation. The invitation had been vague, promising only the new vision for the lakefront and the return of a lost son of Chicago. Backstage, Lucas adjusted his cufflinks. They were platinum, cool against his pulse. Marcus stood beside him, looking more nervous than the man about to face 1,000 cameras. They think you're going to come out in a wheelchair, Marcus murmured, checking his phone. The rumors were that you went to Europe to die in a hospice. Half the board is already preparing eulogies. Let them be disappointed, Lucas said. He didn't smile. He checked his reflection one last time. The suit was impeccable, armor for the modern age. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. The lead architect for the Millennium Extension Project, Mr. Lucas Thorn. The hush that fell over the room was instant and heavy. Then the curtain parted. Lucas walked out. He didn't limp. He didn't hesitate. He moved with a predatory grace, his stride long and eating up the stage. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. The time it took for the audience to reconcile the skeletal invalid of memory with the imposing figure before them. Before the room erupted, flashbulbs went off in a blinding staccato wave, like a lightning storm contained indoors. Lucas stepped to the podium, gripping the edges with strong, steady hands. He waited for the noise to die down. He commanded the silence. Chicago is a city built on ashes, he began, his voice resonant, amplified, filling every corner of the room. We burned down, and we build back stronger. I am no different. 5 miles north, in the penthouse that was now more of a tomb than a home, Elena sat on the floor of the living room. The furniture was gone, sold to pay off the interest on the second mortgage. The art was gone. The only light came from the massive television mounted on the wall, the one thing she couldn't figure out how to unbolt. She stared at the screen, her mouth slightly open, a half-eaten container of cheap takeout noodles beside her. She looked at Lucas. He was magnificent. She had expected him to be dead, or at least broken. She had justified her betrayal to herself 1,000 times by telling Julian that she was merely seeking life in the face of death. But the man on the screen was more alive than anyone she knew. He was more alive than Julian, who had packed his bags and fled the moment the credit card stopped working 3 months ago. On screen, a reporter shouted a question. Mr. Thorn, there are rumors about your personal life. Your absence? Was it a retreat? A spiritual journey? The camera zoomed in on Lucas's face. His eyes were hard, piercing through the lens, seemingly staring right into Elena's living room. It was a renovation, Lucas said, his lip curling slightly. Sometimes to save a structure, you have to strip it down to the studs. You have to remove the rot before it collapses the whole house. I spent 3 years removing the rot. Elena flinched as if he had slapped her. And now, the reporter pressed. Now, Lucas said, turning his gaze to the architectural model unveiled beside him. Now I build something that will last. He looked powerful. He looked untouchable. And for the first time, Elena realized that while she was drowning in the debt and memories he had left behind, he hadn't spent a single second thinking about her. She wasn't an enemy to him anymore. She was just the rot he had cut away. She reached for the remote and turned off the TV, plunging the empty penthouse back into darkness. But the image of him, strong, cold, and victorious, burned behind her eyelids. The invitation had cost Elena her last piece of marketable jewelry, a vintage Cartier watch Lucas had given her for their 5th anniversary. It was a humiliating barter, trading a symbol of their past time together for a few hours of access to his present. The gala was held in the glass atrium of the new cultural center Lucas had designed. It was a soaring, breathtaking space of steel ribs and transparent panels, allowing the night sky to become the ceiling. The irony wasn't lost on her. He had built a cathedral of light while leaving her in the dark. Elena moved through the crowd, clutching a glass of champagne she hadn't tasted. She wore a black velvet gown from 3 seasons ago. It used to hug her curves. Now it hung slightly loose at the waist. Stress had been a cruel sculptor. She noticed the side eyes from the women she used to brunch with, the hushed whispers behind manicured hands. She wasn't Mrs. Thorne, the influential curator, anymore. She was the woman who had lost the city's most valuable man. She spotted him near the center of the room. Lucas was standing under the main archway, surrounded by the mayor and 2 venture capitalists. He looked devastating. The tuxedo fit him like a second skin. He was laughing at something the mayor said, a rich baritone sound she hadn't heard in years. He held a glass of sparkling water with a steady hand. Elena took a breath, smoothed her hair, and pushed through the circle. She needed to be the wife again, just for a moment. If she could just remind him of what they had, maybe the ice would crack. Lucas, she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best effort to sound poised. The conversation in the circle died instantly. The mayor looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. Lucas turned. He didn't startle. He didn't frown. He looked at her with the polite, vague recognition one might offer a former employee whose name they had forgotten. Elena, he said. His voice was cool, level. I didn't expect to see you here. I had to come, she said, stepping closer, ignoring the way the other men took a step back to watch the train wreck. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his jacket. It's your masterpiece, Lucas. I couldn't miss it. We always talked about this project. She emphasized the we. Lucas looked down at her hand on his sleeve. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean into it. He simply looked at it until she felt the awkwardness radiating off him and retracted her hand. That was a long time ago, he said, before the renovation. Lucas, can we talk? She whispered, dropping the facade of the socialite. Her eyes welled up, genuine tears of panic. Please, somewhere private. There's so much you don't know. I've been struggling. The gallery, the apartment. I know about the gallery, Lucas said, cutting her off softly. And the apartment is a matter for the bank, isn't it? I made mistakes, she pleaded, her voice rising, desperation clawing at her throat. I was scared, Lucas. You were sick, and I was scared and weak. But I'm still your wife. The room was silent now. People were openly staring. Lucas took a sip of his water. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching for the anger he thought he might feel. But there was nothing, no hate, no love, just a clinical observation of a structure that had failed its stress test. You aren't my wife, Elena, he said, loud enough for the circle to hear, but calm enough to sound like a statement of fact rather than an insult. You were the person waiting for me to die. I just decided to live instead. He checked his watch. Enjoy the evening, he added, turning his back on her to address the mayor. Now about the zoning for the north wing. Elena stood there, frozen. The rejection wasn't a shout, it was a dismissal. He hadn't evicted her, he had simply ceased to acknowledge she occupied space. The crowd closed back in around him, a wall of black tuxedos and expensive fabric, shutting her out completely. She was alone in the middle of 1,000 people, holding a glass of warm champagne, realizing she had just spent her last asset to buy a front-row seat to her own irrelevance. The heavy glass doors of the cultural center hissed open, allowing the cold Chicago wind to cut through the warmth of the gala. Lucas stepped out onto the curbside, pulling his cashmere coat tighter around his frame. The city sounded different tonight, less like a cage, more like a canvas. "Mr. Thorne, your car is pulling up now," the valet said, holding out a ticket. "Lucas!" The voice was breathless, cracked. He didn't need to turn to know who it was, but he did, out of a final, lingering sense of courtesy. Elena was shivering in the doorway. She hadn't retrieved a coat. Perhaps she had sold that too, or perhaps she just hadn't thought ahead. She hugged her arms around her waist, the velvet dress offering no protection against the biting wind. Her mascara was smudged, a dark, jagged line running down one cheek. She walked toward him, her heels clicking unevenly on the pavement. She stopped 3 feet away, the exact distance of a stranger. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You just win? You destroy me and you drive away?" Lucas looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't destroy you, Elena. I just stopped propping you up. There is a difference." "I have nothing," she sobbed, the dignity finally gone, replaced by raw terror. "The bank is taking the keys on Monday. I'll be on the street. Does that make you happy? Does knowing I'm ruining make you feel like a big man?" She wanted a fight. She wanted him to scream, to blame her, to show that her betrayal had wounded him so deeply that he needed to punish her. Because if he punished her, it meant he still cared. Lucas sighed, a small puff of white mist in the night air. He reached into his pocket. For a second, Elena's eyes lit up, hoping for a checkbook, a card, a lifeline. He pulled out his gloves. He slowly pulled them on, leather stretching over his fingers. "It doesn't make me happy," Lucas said softly. "It doesn't make me think. It's just structural physics, Elena. You built your life on a foundation that wasn't yours. When the support was removed, it collapsed. That's not revenge, that's gravity." A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out to open the rear door. "Lucas, wait," she cried, reaching out to grab his lapel. "I loved you. Before the sickness, I loved you." He paused, his hand on the car door. He looked at her one last time, his eyes reflecting the city lights, the lights he had helped design. "You loved the lifestyle, Elena," he corrected her, his voice devoid of malice, carrying only the weight of absolute truth. "You loved the architect. You never had the stomach for the man." He slipped into the back seat. The heavy door closed with a solid final thunk, sealing out the wind, the noise, and the woman shivering on the curb. As the car pulled away, merging into the stream of red taillights flowing down Michigan Avenue, Lucas didn't look back through the rear window. He opened his portfolio and pulled out a fresh sheet of drafting paper. He took out a pen. Behind him, Elena stood alone under the awning, watching the red lights fade until they were indistinguishable from the thousands of others, just another part of the city that was moving on without her.